Hello, we're going to go through Competency 2 on endocrine regulation. We're going to look at some of the basic ways in which the endocrine system works with the nervous system, and then we'll go through a few of the basics regarding endocrine glands. So some of those specifics you would have got or you would have received when you were in general. So we won't spend a lot of time on the glands, but we will go back through them. My main focus is going to be on endocrine regulation. When we look at the WIDS objectives, we're going to go through relating endocrine function to homeostasis. That's pretty much the main theme throughout this semester, is relating each system to homeostasis. We'll look at hyposecretion and hypersecretion. In fact, a lot of the disorders that we'll find in the clinic that have hypo or hyper in front of them may relate to some sort of dysfunction with an endocrine gland. We're going to look at the basic mechanisms of hormone actions. We'll talk a little bit about hormone transport along with that. We'll look at the relationship between the nervous system and endocrine system and how we can call that the neuroendocrine connection. And then again, we'll look at some of the major hormones and tissues and organs that secrete them and what the target tissues are for those hormones. And then we'll talk a little bit about hormone secretion and then, of course, stress really throughout this unit. So when we look at the endocrine system, we look at the basic organization. Again, we oftentimes will see neuro with endocrine because the nervous system does dictate and regulate how much hormone needs to be produced, how much hormone needs to be released. So when we do have a dysfunction with a particular endocrine gland, we always want to look at the nervous system as well. There's a possibility that the endocrine gland is dysfunctional because the nervous system is directing it to do what it does. So if it's not doing what it's supposed to do, maybe it's being told by the nervous system to be dysfunctional. So if that's the case, we have to definitely address any type of neurotransmitter issues, any structural issues that we may find within the nervous system. So just keep that in mind, that these are connected, and really the nervous system is connected with everything in the body. So anyhow, why do we have an endocrine system? Again, kind of going with the nervous system, it's a communication, integration, and control mechanism. Hormones that are produced by these glands are chemicals, and these chemicals are going to stimulate some sort of or inhibit some sort of activity. So we'll see that as we go. Secreting cells send hormones by way of the bloodstream. So we do know that about the endocrine system, that these glands producing hormones are going to dump their chemistry directly into the bloodstream. Almost every spot in the body is going to have blood flow to it. Therefore, almost every spot in the body could receive specific hormones. And again, these glands are ductless. The exocrine glands are going to have ducts. We've talked a little bit about exocrine glands in the past, like sweat glands, oil glands, earwax glands. So some of our digestive enzymes are going to be secreted by exocrine glands. So we'll see that in later chapters. So when we look at endocrine and nervous signals, one of the main differences, again, we see is that endocrine cells are going to dump their hormone or their chemical directly into the bloodstream. And those chemicals or those hormones are going to have a target cell. And that target cell could be located quite a distance from where the original gland secretes that hormone. So we do see hormone action is a little bit slower when compared to nervous system action. So you'll recall from last section, Competency 1, with nervous system and neurotransmitters, Neurotransmitters are the chemicals of the nervous system that get released directly to a postsynaptic cell. That occurs extremely fast. So if we have acetylcholine, for instance, as a neurotransmitter, it's going to be plugged directly into a muscle. We're going to see that chemical released and picked up by its neighbor. So that's a very fast transaction. Again, with endocrine, we do see slower transactions. Some of the endocrine glands that we'll look at throughout, we've seen some of these before, certainly the pituitary connected with the hypothalamus, the pineal gland, thyroid and parathyroids. And again, these 4 parathyroids are going to be in the posterior aspect or behind the thyroid gland. Then we have the thymus right around the chest area, the adrenals, the pancreas, and then the gonads, the ovaries and testes. So today, in this video, we won't spend a lot of time on the gonads, nor will we spend a lot of time on the thymus gland. We will see these in different chapters. So the thymus we'll talk about when we get to immunity. The gonads certainly we'll discuss when we get to the reproductive system. Now, when we look at all of these glands, we see that they're going to produce different types of hormones. And these hormones can be categorized in multiple different ways. One of the ways that we see hormones classified is this first kind of group here. We see the tropic hormones. So whenever you see tropo or tropic or tropos, tropho even with a PH in any word, it means something with change. Something is changing when we have a tropic situation. So tropic hormones generally are going to target other endocrine glands and cause a change in the endocrine gland or a trigger in the endocrine gland to secrete its hormones. So oftentimes tropic hormones are going to be kind of a precursor hormone for a gland to release its own hormone. So they stimulate generally growth and secretion. So if we ever see secreting hormone or growth hormone, that's going to have something to do with a change or a tropic aspect. So we'll look at tropic hormones later. Certainly sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen, we'll focus on those later in the semester. But their targets, of course, are going to be reproductive organs. Okay. And then we're going to see what we call the anabolic hormones. There are certain hormones that stimulate anabolism. And remember, anabolic means we're building something. Okay. So an anabolic reaction is a synthesis or a building reaction. So certain hormones are released to encourage building something. Okay. And then the last 2 categories we view and kind of compare, and we'll do this moving forward really throughout this chapter, the steroid versus non-steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are a very small percentage of the overall amount of hormones. They are lipid or fat-based. We can see cholesterol listed there. So steroid hormones relate to lipids or fats, whereas non-steroidal hormones generally relate to amino acids, okay, or protein-based. So we'll look at some of those now. We see, and again, there's a lot of words, a lot of different hormones listed here. I don't expect you to walk away today and say, yep, I know that these are steroid hormones, these are non-steroid hormones. However, as time goes on and you see some of this information more and more, you may start to classify these as being steroidal or non-steroidal. When you guys take your pharmacology classes, you'll be studying these classifications in a little bit more detail. The key to this whole course, physiology, is to understand that you're given an introduction to some of the basic functional aspects of the chemistry of the human body, and pharmacology is a lot more detail on the chemistry or the physiology of the human body and how we can potentially increase or decrease or stimulate or depress what is supposed to be going on in the body that may not be. So that's the goal for a pharmacology student, is to understand, or any health student, when they take pharmacology, to understand that most pharmaceuticals are there to either replace, stimulate, or inhibit what you already have. So if you're deficient in some of these hormones, then we can prescribe a medication that will increase that particular hormone or even replace it. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go. Some of these hormones you're going to recognize maybe as they relate to the clinical aspect in certain pharmacology. So anyhow, steroids, these are, again, lipid-based or fatty acid-based. They're derived from cholesterol. And so we're going to see a couple of these right away that we recognize: estrogen and testosterone. So the two main sex hormones are going to be steroidal. We also see progesterone. That's going to be available during pregnancy. So we'll see progesterone kind of working with estrogen in the ovaries as far as being another sex hormone. Again, all under the steroid category. So these bottom three, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, are the main sex hormones. And then we have two others in the steroid category. Cortisol, you've maybe heard of that, hydrocortisone, cortisone shots, cortisone creams. Cortisol we find in the adrenal glands. We're going to see that a little bit later coming up. But cortisol is an anti-inflammatory. It's one of your body's natural anti-inflammatory chemicals, cortisol. And then aldosterone, which is also going to come from that same area, the adrenal area. We're going to see aldosterone playing a major role in sodium and potassium balance, so and water balance. So later on in the semester, we spend a whole week studying pH balance, water balance, and sodium balance. Aldosterone is going to pop up in a major way in a couple of units from now. So anyhow, aldosterone, cortisol, and then the sex hormones. Those are the steroids. So if it's not one of those five, then it goes in the non-steroidal category. So if you're asked, is insulin a steroidal, non-steroidal, both, or neither hormone? Well, we know it's got to be one or the other, steroidal or non-steroidal. And again, insulin is not one of our sex hormones, nor does it help with anti-inflammation or balance of sodium. So anyway, insulin would then be considered a non-steroidal hormone. So when we look at the non-steroidals, we can break them up into a couple different groups. We have 4 different non-steroidal groups. And again, they're primarily amino acid based. Okay. So we're going to see nitrogen. We're going to see protein involved, peptide, protein, amino acid. These are all related to nitrogen. Okay, so proteins, non-steroidal protein hormones, we've got a list here: the insulin-glucagon combo. We see the parathyroid calcitonin, calcium balance combo, growth hormone, and prolactin as well. So we'll talk a little bit about these as we go, not just today, but throughout the semester. Same with the glycoprotein non-steroidal group. We see a couple of follicle-stimulating and luteinizing hormones, as well as thyroid-stimulating hormone, and HCG, which is the hormone that exists in high levels after fertilization takes place. So once the fertilization process has occurred. The zygote has become an embryo. The embryo implants in the uterus. At that point, HCG levels are going to be high. So this is what the pregnancy tests are testing for, HCG. We see a couple of stimulating hormones coming from the pituitary up here. Glyco, by the way, means we have an extra sugar attached to the protein molecule. Then we end up with peptides and amino acid derivatives. So we've got several more hormones. ADH, an antidiuretic hormone, so it helps you to retain water. Oxytocin, which is a uterine contracting chemical. Yeah, and then a few others. In the amino acids group, we've got epinephrine, norepinephrine, a couple of big ones for sympathetic or stress. And then the two thyroid hormones, amino acid derivatives. So anyway, you can see there are a lot of different hormones. Is it important that you know every one of these? Well, probably not today, but I think over the next 12 weeks or so, you should be able to recognize most of these as being associated with a particular organ system and a particular function that they might do. So again, I start the semester with nervous and endocrine because it gives you just kind of a basic foundation of what we're going to see throughout. So again, if in these first few weeks you're struggling a little bit with all of this information, don't worry about it. Don't sweat it. Don't get stressed out because you're going to see a lot of this information throughout. So you get that continual exposure to these difficult concepts. So okay, so just going through a couple of more items that I'd mentioned, steroidal versus non-steroidal. That's the chart we just looked at. Again, synthesized from cholesterol, lipid soluble. Okay, so this is why one of the main reasons we need to consume fats to get the fatty acids that are going to help us with the production of these particular hormones. So folks who have issues with inflammation may be lacking cortisol. Folks who have issues with water retention may have issues with aldosterone. So excess edema could be an aldosterone problem. Folks who have estrogen and progesterone problems, progesterone is the main hormone that comes about, again, once fertilization has taken place, the baby, the embryo has implanted into the uterus, progesterone levels are going to be high throughout the pregnancy. So if we have a patient who is having issues with miscarriages or something, we could have a progesterone imbalance, not enough of it. And then certainly testosterone levels with males being off could be a result of lipid, cholesterol, and fatty acid deficiencies. So a no-fat diet or extremely low-fat diet can really do a number on your ability to continue the production of these 5 hormones. The rest of them, being non-steroidal, again, are synthesized from amino acids primarily. And we're going to see these as proteins or glycoproteins or peptide hormones. The 4th category was amino acid derivatives. So we look at a couple of those. Again, epinephrine, I put that in there because that's one of the biggies. We looked at it a little bit in the nervous system, but we do see epinephrine as a big one with the sympathetic nervous system and the stress response that occurs. Amino acid derivatives are produced by the thyroid gland, and then they get synthesized by adding iodine or tyrosine. So when we go back to the amino acid derivatives, we see the thyroid group and we see the amine group. The amine group synthesize tyrosine or tryptophan. These are two specific types of amino acids. We have 20 different amino acids, and these are two of them. So when you consume food that has tyrosine or tryptophan, so any protein, tryptophan is in higher levels in poultry animal protein, but we find it in cow protein, in beef too. So anyway, you could get tyrosine and tryptophan from eggs, from nuts, legumes, and any other types of proteins. And then what happens is you're going to be able to break these down and synthesize one of these molecules into epinephrine. So anyway, that's just a side note. I just threw those in there because they're a little bit different than the rest, but they're still in that non-steroidal group. Okay. So what's the point of having hormones? Why do we have them? What do we need them for? And what are the actions? How do we get the hormones delivered? And once they're delivered, how do we get them to work? So that's in essence what's going on here. So if there's a cell or a group of cells or tissue or an organ in the body that's lacking something or has an excess of something, a signal is going to get sent via that autonomic nervous system that's going to communicate with the central nervous system to determine what types of needs that the particular organ or cells may have. So once a gland gets a signal, it's going to release hormones and put those hormones into the bloodstream. Once those hormones reach the target cell, we're going to see this lock and key mechanism. And all that is saying is that a specific key will only fit into a specific lock. So I can't use a master key to open up any lock in the body. So on the membranes of our cells, we have these receptor sites that hormones and other chemicals are going to attach or link to. The hormone is going to be a specific shape, and that shape, the key, has to fit the specific receptor site or the lock in order for the hormone to be able to enter into the cell or for the hormone to trigger some sort of response from the cell. So the target cell has specific membrane proteins that behave like a lock. And so when these hormones or these chemicals come in, they're attempting to plug into the lock. Okay, and if they do plug into the lock, we're going to get some sort of action going on with the cell. It could be something as simple as a hormone attaches to the membrane protein that triggers some sort of protein synthesis to occur within the cell. Sometimes the hormone needs to go inside of the cell. And once the hormone's inside the cell, it's going to trigger cellular respiration or some sort of cellular function. So different hormone receptors, of course, then will produce different types of cellular action or changes in the target cell. So the idea is a target cell must need something, whether it needs to stop doing what it's doing, start doing something, continue doing something, slow something down, any possibility of a cell's behavior that you can think of is going to be manipulated by the presence of specific hormones. So again, when a cell is behaving erratically, the brain is going to get a signal saying the big toe cell is, or a cell in the big toe is behaving erratically. It's inflamed. There's a lot of action going on. So the brain will then tell specific glands to release specific hormones to target that big toe cell and either speed things up or slow things down. So there are some combined hormone actions. A lot of hormones will work better when they're together. So that's what we call synergism. We see that just in general day-to-day life. Synergy or synergism involves two or more working together for a common cause to elicit some sort of change. So we see this with hormones. We can combine certain hormones and get the action enhanced because of synergy or having more than one hormone involved. Permissiveness, some hormones can't do what they need to do without another hormone coming in and permitting that original hormone to perform its action. So it's similar to synergism, where you have two hormones working together. However, with synergism, the two coming together are going to work together for a common cause, whereas with permissiveness, this one is going to do all the work. But in order for this one to do the work, this one has to come in and give it kind of a pat on the back or give it an ID card or whatever to say, go ahead and I'm going to permit you to go continue to do whatever it is you need to do. So the secondary hormone that does the permitting is not going to necessarily help. It's going to help by allowing the original hormone to do its work. So synergism, they both come together, they both do the work. Permissiveness, one comes in to do the work, but they need a pass in order to do the work. So that's the difference there. Antagonism, just like it sounds, we may have a hormone that inhibits another hormone from doing what it needs to do. So an antagonist is going to go against the original hormone. So if we do have we see this clinically where an antagonist may be over responsive or maybe overactive. So we see this with serotonin is one of it's a neurotransmitter, but neurotransmitters and hormones do in essence behave in a very similar fashion. Again, neurotransmitters are very local. Hormones generally travel throughout the body. So when we look at serotonin, there's an antagonist that enables a certain amount of serotonin to be released, but then the antagonist comes in and kind of causes it to get taken back up, reabsorbed basically. And sometimes an antagonist doesn't work, or it works too good. So sometimes the antagonist will come in and tell serotonin that it's not going to allow the cells to reabsorb it. So it may inhibit the reuptake of serotonin, which sometimes we want that. We want serotonin to continue doing what it's doing. If we allow it to go in and then we want to bring it back too quickly, then that can cause mood problems. So reuptake inhibitors kind of block that serotonin from getting reabsorbed too quickly. We want it to go run its full course. So anyway, the inhibitor chemical might be a problem, the antagonist. So anyway, just remember, everything we do in this course can relate back to the clinic, can relate back to pharmacology, and if you've ever wondered why we prescribe certain drugs, well, it's either because we need some better synergism, we need to enhance stimuli, we need to permit certain hormones or chemistry to get in, or we need to prevent it. So anyway, that's why pharmacology and treatment of patients is very complicated. And you're finding that, and those of you who are working on your case studies are seeing firsthand just how complex the process of diagnosing really can be. So anyway, circulating blood. So this is showing hormones circulating in the bloodstream. Remember, we see this big C word, capillary. Remember, that's the only blood vessel that we can allow anything to leave the bloodstream or enter the bloodstream. So we see these arrows going out of the bloodstream. It simply means that we're at a capillary network. If this was a vein or an artery, we wouldn't see these arrows leaving the vessel. Okay, so the only place in the body where we see the delivery of chemistry is in a capillary network. So I will mention that 100 more times at least this semester. So those of you who've had me in the past know that already, that there are certain things that I drive home into your brains to etch it long term. And capillaries exchanging substances is a big deal. So again, if we have blood flow issues, that could prevent the capillaries from allowing substances to enter or leave. So again, whenever we have an area of the body where we don't have enough nutrients going, it could be a hormone problem. It could be a nervous system problem. It could be a structural issue. It could be a blood flow or a cardiovascular issue. And that's one of the big clinical areas that we really focus on, certainly is cardiovascular. Is the heart pumping? Do we have blood pressure in line? Do we have blood flow? Do we have peripheral capillary fill? Do we have pulse oximeter in order? So much of what we do on the basic clinical diagnostic testing level comes with testing blood and blood or blood physiology, cardiovascular physiology. So we'll spend quite a bit of time here in a couple of weeks really getting more into cardiovascular. So anyway, we see these kind of pentagon or five-sided molecules or hormones. They get dumped off to their target. And notice we have these cells that have these integral membrane proteins. Okay, and notice this lock is a U-shaped, whereas this lock has that V shape. So these specific hormone molecules are going to be able to attach to these target cells. These are non-target cells, so a different hormone would have the configuration of more or less like a U shape, so it could fit in there. So if you wonder how can I take a medication, or how can I eat broccoli or something high in magnesium and calcium, how can I drink milk and ensure that these chemicals are going to get to where they need to go? Pardon me. That's where these target cells and the shapes of the chemicals come into play. Just think as all chemicals you consume, whether it's food, drink, pharmacology, all of the chemicals you consume are going to have, on the molecular level, they're going to have specific shapes. And in the body, the cells are going to possess locks on their membranes that allow for certain shapes to attach and then enter into the cell, or trigger the cell to behave in a certain way. Pardon me. Okay. So let's see, steroid hormone action. They work a little different than the non-steroidal hormones. Remember, a cell membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. So when we look at this cell membrane, we notice it's a double layer, and you also want to recall from general A&P that the cell membrane is primarily lipid or fat-based. Okay. And these receptor sites, remember, are protein-based. They're integral membrane proteins. That just means it's protein that's embedded in the cell membrane. Okay. But the rest of the membrane is fat or lipid. So because steroids are lipid soluble, the receptor sites for steroidal hormones typically are found inside of the cell, in the cytosol. So the receptors for fat or steroidal hormones are going to be found inside of the cell. Call it cytoplasm or cytosol. So the steroid hormone can just enter right into the cell. It doesn't have to fit into any type of lock. Once it's in that cell, then it's going to locate its specific receptor sites on some of the organelles of the cell. So that's all this is talking about. It's a lot of info, but again, lipid soluble just means it's steroidal. Okay? It also means it can pass right through the cell membrane. Once it's inside of the cell, it's swimming around in the cell plasm, cytosol or cytoplasm. From there, it can enter into a smooth ER. It can hook up with the nucleus even. Some of these hormones may pass all the way into the nucleus and trigger some sort of gene sequencing in the DNA that's ultimately going to be transcribed into what we call RNA. So steroidal hormones really help with some of the basics of mitosis, cell replication, or DNA replication of the cell. So anyhow, when we look inside of a cell, in the nucleus, we see DNA getting kind of photocopied. We call it transcribing. Once in that RNA, which is the transcribed chunk or the photocopy of the DNA, we can put that out of the nucleus and ultimately get it to the ribosomes, the Golgi, the rough ER. All of these items inside of the cytoplasm are going to take that message, that transcription from the nucleus, and they're going to translate it. They're going to read the blueprint outside of the nucleus in the cytoplasm. And again, we need steroidal hormones oftentimes to initiate that to happen. So when we do have genetic mutations, it could be a problem with lipid or steroidal hormone levels. So. Okay, so, and just like most hormones, the amount present determines the magnitude of the response. So a little tiny spritz of steroid hormone, you get a little response from the cell. We flood the cell with steroid hormone, we're going to get a large response. And again, transcription and protein synthesis take time. So response to steroid hormones is slower even than non-steroidal hormones. We see hormonal response being slowed anyway relative to neurotransmitter response. So, so anyway, again, transcription is maybe a new term for you. We're going to spend time next module going into a little bit of DNA, RNA stuff. Even our next chapter, our next competency deals with cell metabolism. So we'll look at cells and DNA and RNA a little bit, but transcription just means that we're making a photocopy of a specific chunk of DNA inside of the nucleus. Protein synthesis and translation are going to occur in the cytoplasm or the cytosol. And again, to trigger this to happen, we need to allow for steroidal hormones to enter into the cell. So they have no problem getting into the cell because of the phospholipid bilayer. Once they're inside the cell, in the cytoplasm, at that point, they can go after the nucleus and help to basically deliver a message to the nucleus saying, we need you to transcribe X particular recipe In other words, we need you to photocopy this recipe and deliver it out of the nucleus into the cytoplasm, so then the factory can translate the recipe and start making whatever the recipe calls for. So again, nuclear receptor mechanism. That sounds like a mouthful, but all it's just saying is everything we've been talking about is that the steroid hormones or the fat-soluble hormones are going to have their receptors inside of the cell and typically on the surface of the nucleus. Okay, and all of this is the homeostasis aspect. Again, we're dealing with that negative feedback loop. Okay, so the way homeostasis works is when the brain receives a stimulus, it's going to kind of integrate that information, determine what to do, and elicit or send out a response. And typically the response is going to go against the stimulus. So if the stimulus is, I'm seeing bright light, the response from the brain is going to be, I need to oppose the bright light. So we could constrict the pupils, we could cover our faces, whatever it might be. Negative feedback is simply opposing the brain, sending out a response that opposes the stimulus. Remember, everything comes down to stimulus response. Stimulus comes in, we want to oppose the stimulus potentially. That's called negative feedback. So feedback is simply the response. Okay? If it's negative feedback, it just means we oppose the stimulus. Okay? And again, endocrine, the nervous system triggered will use the endocrine system to deliver its chemical messages. So the central nervous system uses neurotransmitters and hormones to elicit some sort of change that opposes the stimulus. And again, we can either upregulate, maybe the stimulus is, I don't have enough energy or ATP in a specific group of cells, so we need to upregulate glucose release, insulin release, potentially antidiuretic aspects, angiotensin, which we'll see helps to constrict blood vessels. So there's upregulation. We need more hormone activity. And then, of course, if we have upregulation, we have downregulation. So again, just like that feedback loop, homeostasis, we're like this. There are certain times when we need more of something. And then once we're up here, our set point is now here. So I then need to downregulate to bring me back into homeostasis. If we do have some chemistry where homeostasis is here, we have a downregulation going on, then we need something that's going to upregulate to bring us back to homeostasis. So these mechanisms can be tricky when they're not working properly. That's what leads people to the clinic typically, is there something has gone on that's put them out of homeostasis. So are they out of homeostasis because their chemistry has been upregulated for too long and we're unable to downregulate, so we're stuck in a higher set point? Or are we in a situation where they've been downregulated for too long and we don't have enough to bring them back up to homeostasis? So we could have a hyperactive endocrine and ultimately maybe immune response, hypersecretion. We could have hyposecretion where we don't have enough of an endocrine or an immune response. So upregulation and downregulation, it's like this constant teeter-totter mechanism. Okay. By the way, a couple of side notes I want to throw in. Eicosanoids are a specific group of lipid or fat hormones, and they're fairly new to the scene. They've known about them. They, meaning science, has known about these for quite a while, but how they function and what they're doing and their actions has been somewhat of a mystery up until recently. So we do see they call these tissue hormones and prostaglandins. So these are fat hormones or steroidal hormones. However, they're chemically like a hormone, but functionally and location wise, they behave maybe more like a neurotransmitter. In other words, eicosanoids generally don't travel very far. Their targets are next door neighbors. So usually we think of neurotransmitters as targeting their neighbor, and we think of hormones as targeting someone that's further away. Eicosanoids are not neurotransmitters because they're not released from a nerve. So they're a hormone. They're released from something more that resembles a gland. But the chemical or the hormone that's released stays local. So that's why they're kind of like a third category of chemical. Neurotransmitters, hormones, and eicosanoids are kind of in between. So they call them tissue hormones because generally they're created in a tissue or a cell, and they affect local tissue or neighboring cells. And prostaglandin, we'll look at these in a few minutes. So again, tissue hormones, secretion produced in a tissue diffuses a short distance to neighboring cells. Generally, we think of neurotransmitters doing that type of thing. Prostaglandins are they're not new, relatively newly identified. We're actually finding more prostaglandins every day. Again, diverse physiologic effects. It's generally, again, staying locally. We do have a few structural classes. They call them PGs, prostaglandins, and then the letter that identifies them. PGAs, PGEs, PGFs, for instance. And again, these are going to be structural tissue hormones, lipid-based, that are going to help with some of the local stuff that's going on. Okay. Local physiology. We've talked about some endocrine disorders a little bit. Hyper versus hypo. Again, when something's hyper secreted, there's too much of it. Hyperthyroidism is one of the biggies that we see. Hypothyroidism. So thyroid's one of the big dogs for some of these secretion problems. We could, and by the way, too, most of our hormones and most of our glands that produce, our endocrine glands that are producing and secreting hormones, most of them are going to be regulated or dictated by the pituitary or hypothalamus. So if we do have a problem with the thyroid, we can treat the thyroid. We may get good response, but if we don't, maybe the problem is up higher. Maybe it's in the pituitary gland. Maybe the pituitary is not secreting what it needs to secrete to encourage the thyroid to do what it's supposed to do. So the thyroid doesn't work because the pituitary doesn't work. And maybe the pituitary doesn't work because the hypothalamus doesn't work, because the hypothalamus tells the pituitary what to do. The pituitary tells everybody else what to do. So in essence, the hypothalamus is kind of like the owner of the store, whereas the pituitary is kind of like the manager of the store. Every other gland in the body are the grunts or the customer service reps of the store. So if the thyroid, being a customer service rep, isn't doing what it's supposed to do, then maybe the store manager, the pituitary, hasn't been giving it the right directives. Well, where's the store manager get its directives? From the owner. And that's the hypothalamus. So somewhere along the lines, if an adrenal gland is dysfunctional, a pancreas is dysfunctional, a thyroid is dysfunctional, we could have a problem further back with the pituitary. Okay? Could have a problem even further back with the hypothalamus. Well, what tells the hypothalamus what to do? Every owner has an owner, right? Well, that's going to be the cerebrum and other higher level aspects of the brain. So there's a possibility that the hypothalamus doesn't work right because there's something wrong with the neurons and the neurotransmitters of the cerebrum, or of maybe the thalamus, okay, the diencephalon. So anyway, endocrine glands, I don't want to spend a heck of a lot of time. I don't have much else to, well, I've always got a lot to say. I do appreciate all of you watching these videos, doing all of the hard work you've been doing. I know that it's very challenging working in an online setting. It's challenging for both of us. I'm very used to seeing all of you in person and helping you in that manner. So again, always remember that I have office hours live Tuesdays and Thursdays from 11 to 1:30. So check in at any time if you have help, or if you need help. If you just needed to email me, that's fine too. But just know that you are embarking on challenging information. I've been studying it for over 20 years, and it's still, I'm still learning too, believe it or not, as I'm putting all these puzzle pieces together. So your learning of anatomy and physiology is lifelong. So just take little bits from each section and build and build and build, and you'll steadily, as you move forward in your other classes, you'll have some of this foundational information that you can take with you. So anyway, off of that soapbox, pituitary and pineal. Again, the pituitary is the master gland. We've talked about it quite a bit in general. So again, I don't want to spend a heck of a lot of time. You guys can go back through and review some of the pituitary hormones on your own. But they're hidden here as well. Remember, with the pituitary, we do separate it into anterior and posterior. So we do have 5 major secretory cells in the anterior pituitary: somatotrophs, corticotrophs. This sounds like a mouthful, right? So we can abbreviate some of these hormones, or really all of them. So, so anyway, gonadotropin, or growth hormone, somato. Somato has to do with the body. We generally think of soma. Whenever we see soma or somato, if you haven't had med term, soma or somato generally has to do with musculature and growth of more of the like physical aspects of the body. Just thinking like skeletal muscles. So growth hormones. Cortico always relates to the cortex of the, specifically with endocrine, of the adrenal gland. So ACTH is adrenocorticotropic hormone. So corticotroph, that just means something coming from the cortex that causes change. There are cortexes or cortices in other organs. The pancreas has a cortex, kidneys have a cortex. So they do specify what cortex is it coming from. The adrenal cortex, ACTH. Thyrotroph, so change. Remember, troph means change. Changes the thyroid. Okay, thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, so again, the thyroid will only function if the anterior pituitary is providing it with TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. lactotroph. So lacto, of course, has to do with milk, changing of lactose. Prolactin is the breast milk producing hormone. And then, of course, gonado, having to do with the testes and the ovaries. We see change in the gonads, gonadotrophs, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. We will look at these in more detail when we get to the reproductive system. Okay, now what controls the pituitary? Again, the owner. The hypothalamus is going to secrete what we call releasing hormones. So we're going to see RH with a lot of hypothalamic hormones. Okay. Let's look at some of those real quick. We see the hypothalamus up here. We see R, 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 R. That just means releasing. So GN, oh, and the H always means hormone when it's at the end. So GN means gonadotropin, or gonads releasing hormone. Growth hormone releasing hormone. Somatostatin, which we'll talk about that later on, but soma means body. Okay, so it's probably going to relate to the growth. This red means it's an inhibiting hormone. Okay, so when the hypothalamus gets a message from the cerebrum saying we need to increase growth hormone, that doesn't mean we need to increase growth hormone forever. It just means right now. So growth hormone releasing hormone gets triggered. That's going to go to the anterior pituitary and stimulate growth hormone to be released. Growth hormone is going to trigger nutrient metabolism and tissue growth. We just got done eating, something like that, or we're exercising. Maybe we need to increase some of how we metabolize nutrients. Well, at some point we're going to cool down, or we're going to take a nap, or things are going to slow down a little bit. The brain perceives that, we've stopped working, we've stopped eating, we're slowing everything down. So it's going to release the inhibiting hormone, what they call somatostatin. So that's going to then get released by the hypothalamus and go to the anterior pituitary and tell it to decrease production of growth hormone. That's all. Okay. TRH, thyroid releasing hormone. Okay. And then we have another inhibitory, prolactin inhibitory hormone. Will inhibit prolactin. Prolactin releasing hormone. And corticotropic releasing hormone. Okay, so all these releasing hormones from the hypothalamus are going to go right to the anterior pituitary. Then we go into the blood, and then these are the targets down here for each of these. ACTH targets, adrenal cortex, and cortisol secretion. Prolactin, breast development and milk production. Thyroid stimulating leads to the thyroid pumping out T3 and T4. FSH and LH target the gonads and trigger estrogen and testosterone secretion. So again, if I've got a problem all the way down here, I don't have enough estrogen, or I don't have enough testosterone, I don't have enough cortisol. Could it be a problem? So we just work our way backwards. Could be a problem here, here, or here. Well, could be the problem here could be because of anterior pituitary. It could be because of blood circulation, right? Maybe I have a problem here because I have a circulatory problem that doesn't allow for the right amounts of ACTH to even get to the adrenal glands. Well, it's clear here. It's clear here. Maybe there's a problem with the anterior pituitary. Yep, that looks clear. Maybe there's a portal. Remember when we see portal in the body, it's a blood thing, like hepatic portal system. So it's a specialized blood vessel delivery system. So The hypophysis is basically the stalk of the hypothalamus where it connects to the pituitary. So maybe there's a tumor in the hypophyseal portal, or there's a blood clot or something. If all this is clear, then we work it back to the hypothalamus. Maybe there's something wrong up here. And then we can even go further. Maybe there's something going on with the reticular activating system of the cerebrum and the diencephalon, the thalamus. So anyway, that's the flow chart down and flow chart back. Okay. There are several other slides in here. I'm going to wrap this up. You're welcome to look through them, certainly. Posterior pituitary has ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin, which is a uterine contracting hormone. Antidiuretic prevents you from accumulating too much water, right? Or from releasing too much water, right? Diuretic means I'm peeing a lot. So antidiuretic keeps you from peeing a lot. So you're going to retain more water. So, if you're dehydrated, the brain perceives the stimulus is I'm dehydrated. Negative feedback, remember, I want to oppose dehydration. So the response is going to be retain water. Okay, so antidiuretic hormone triggers the kidneys to do a few things, one of which is reabsorb more water. So we're going to look at ADH in more detail when we get to the kidneys. We'll look at oxytocin a little bit when we make it to reproductive. Okay, again, uterine contraction. Clinically, this is called Pitocin. Okay. So the pineal, we've looked at that a little bit. That's your melatonin, your biological clock, or your circadian rhythm, your sleep and wake cycles regulated by the pineal gland. We look at the thyroid a little bit. We'll spend some time on the thyroid coming up here in a few weeks. We'll get into calcium homeostasis a little bit with the digestive system. But yeah, the thyroid produces T3 and T4. Notice within each one we have iodo. That just means there's iodine involved. Thyroid helps with metabolism. So if we have a metabolism problem, too much, we're burning calories too fast, or we're not burning them at all, it could be a thyroid problem. So obesity is oftentimes linked to maybe a thyroid issue. Graves' disease or something involving being very gaunt, frail, thin. Also a hypersecretion issue. So hyposecretion, not enough thyroid hormone, slows metabolism. Hypersecretion of thyroid causes too much metabolism. Okay. We also see a third hormone with the thyroid called calcitonin. That's going to enable calcium by bone cells to absorb calcium from the blood. So bone cells store calcium. So when we consume calcium, it goes into our guts and then into our bloodstream. Calcitonin will get released to encourage bone cells to pull calcium out of the blood. So I can lower calcium levels in the blood by storing it in the bone. Calcium we'll see is extremely important for a lot of basic metabolic functions in the body, such as simply contracting a muscle. Simply getting the heart to contract is going to involve calcium. So if I don't have enough calcium in the blood, then I can trigger parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone will go to bone and say, hey, we need some of that calcium. Okay, so when calcium levels are low, parathyroid hormone can go ask bone to give up some of that calcium. Okay. And again, they're small. They're going to be located in the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland. So again, we see parathyroid and thyroid with calcium homeostasis. So I have high calcium levels in my blood. Probably just means I consumed a bunch of good veggies and maybe guzzled some milk. So my calcium levels went up. So what do I do with that calcium? Well, I'm probably going to use some of it right away, but most of it is going to need to be stored. So calcitonin from the thyroid is going to be released and trigger the storage of that calcium to go into the bone. Now, between meals, if I need calcium to keep my heart beating, then I'm going to get parathyroid hormone to get secreted. Parathyroid is going to go help to break down some of the bone so calcium gets released into the bloodstream, and then we attain normal blood volumes. So anyhow, adrenal glands are next. So we will talk about these quite a bit coming up here in a few weeks. I just want to introduce you again to the fact that we have cortex and medulla. The cortex is the endocrine aspect that's going to be found on the outside of the adrenal, the more superficial layer. That's where we're going to find cortisol. And then the medulla is where we're going to find the neurosecretory stuff. So here's the cortex. That's where cortisol, the anti-inflammatory, is. And then in the medulla is where we're going to find epinephrine primarily, or adrenaline. So let's go here. There are 3 layers of the cortex. And these 3 layers, again, they're going to have corto in their name: mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and gonadocorticoids, all released from a different area. So we'll look at these briefly here in a few minutes. And then the medullary, the medulla, the inner chunk of the adrenal glands, will produce what we call catecholamines. And we'll see those as like adrenaline as an example, or epinephrine. So, so mineral corticoids and glucocorticoids. We're going to stick to the cortex hormones. Aldosterone is the only mineral corticoid in the body that's of importance. So aldosterone is going to come from that area. And what aldosterone does is promotes potassium loss. So that what that does is promote sodium absorption. So water always follows sodium. So what aldosterone does is triggers the release of potassium out of the blood. So what it, in turn, it triggers the uptake of sodium into the blood, and water follows sodium. So the water is going to go into the bloodstream as well. And it's a form of water retention. So one way to retain water is just reabsorb more water in the kidneys. Another way is to reabsorb more sodium in the kidneys. The water will chase it to dilute it. So aldosterone does that. We'll talk about it again in more detail later. Glucocorticoids those are the anti-inflammatories. Cortisol, cortisone, particularly. This renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is something that we're going to spend quite a bit of time on when we get to the kidneys and some of our water balance stuff. So we're going to look at blood pressure a little bit. So we'll see this RAAS, renin. That just means it's a chemical from the kidney. Angiotensin means a blood vessel, and angio is shrinking or becoming more tense, so constricting. So we're going to decrease the diameter of blood vessels with angiotensin. It's going to cause constriction. And then aldosterone, we just learned, helps with eliminating potassium and absorbing sodium, therefore retaining water. So notice too, we have the lungs involved and we have the kidneys involved. So we're going to look at this in a lot of detail. I just put it in here today to just so you can see that there's an interconnection with the blood vessels, with the lungs, and with the kidneys. And part of that is going to involve then the adrenal glands. The adrenals and kidneys are always together. So, but we're going to look at these intimately, or as they are intimately connected, the lungs and the kidneys, when it comes to regulating pH and basically keeping your water, sodium, potassium levels where they need to be. Okay, so let's see, the let me back up. So we did the mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, or your cortisones, and then the gonadocorticoids. Of course, gonado means the gonads. So we do see some androgens released from the adrenal cortex, specifically in females. We generally, and males too, males produce testosterone in the testes, so that keeps that's considered an androgen. Females have small traces of testosterone or of androgens in their body in the form of gonadocorticoids. So, so when the adrenal gland, specifically the gonadocorticoid section, we call it the zona reticularis, the deepest section of the cortex, when that produces excess androgen in a female, that can alter some of the qualities that fall under the umbrella of estrogen levels. So we may start to see secondary sex characteristics in a female that are male-based, like facial hair, deepening of the voice, other secondary sex characteristics that we may find in a male, we'd see in a female, potentially again because of the presence of too much androgen or testosterone coming from the gonadocorticoids, or that zona reticularis. So anyway, the last section, adrenal medulla, again, the innermost section, we think of epinephrine and norepinephrine. And again, these fall into the non-steroidal group. We call them catecholamines. So the stress, so how do we deal with stress? Again, those are the stress hormones. We see sympathetic effectors. Okay, so we've got the adrenal glands, we've got epinephrine and norepinephrine released from the adrenal medulla directly into the bloodstream. And then the target cells, this could be a heart cell, this could be a skeletal muscle cell. We see the sympathetic effector cell. So remember, cardiac increases, respiratory increases, blood pressure increases, a lot of smooth muscle activity increases, except for digestion. We see digestion decrease. But so anyhow, we have what are called adrenergic receptor sites. Okay? Adrenergic just means simulating an adrenaline response, which would be a sympathetic or stress response. So how hormones play a role with stress, again, we're going to see epinephrine and norepinephrine being triggered to be released into the bloodstream and head to a target cell that, again, is going to have these adrenergic receptors. Okay. We also see norepinephrine being released directly from some of our neurons. So we do see norepinephrine occasionally coming up as a neurotransmitter as well. Okay. Lastly, pancreas, we have what are called the islets. That's where we're going to see alpha, beta, delta, epsilon cells. These are those island cells that produce glucagon, insulin, somatostatin, and pancreatic polypeptides. So there's a lot of stuff going on just with the endocrine portion of the pancreas. Glucagon, insulin are the two biggies. Glucagon triggers stored glucose to get released from the liver, so we can increase blood sugar levels with glucagon. When there's too much glucose in the blood, insulin will pull glucose out. Somatostatin, again, we saw that earlier. That's going to regulate, coming from all the way up in the hypothalamus, that can help to regulate other endocrine cells. These guys down here, the delta cells, okay, and the epsilon cells. Polypeptide helps with digestion and distribution of nutrients. So again, we have low blood glucose levels, so there's not enough sugar in the blood. So we can increase glucagon and decrease insulin. The glucagon goes to the liver and we release stored glucose. So now the glucose level is going to increase. At that point, then we're going to have to secrete some insulin. So we'll talk more about this quite a bit in the digestive system. And then lastly, the testes and ovaries, we save those for the reproductive system, testosterone and estrogen. Thymus, again, we save that one for the immune system, deals a lot with immunity. And then when we get to the digestive tract, we'll see gastrin, secretin, and CCK, a couple of big hormones that play a role in the digestive process. So, and then finally, we don't really think of the heart as being an endocrine organ. However, it does secrete ANH, atrial natriuretic hormone. So we'll see this play a role when we look at fluid balance here in a couple of weeks. So you see that word atrial in there. So we would definitely relate that to the heart. So anyhow, we'll talk about all of these in more detail. I think for now, you've had plenty to go from. So if you have questions, again, please email me and I'll get back to you as soon as I can.